Hi, everybody. We're just saying a quick hello to the people that have shown up early. Thanks so much. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. I see some more people hopping on. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a minute. All right, Shasta, you can kick us off whenever you want.
Okay, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us for our fourth webinar in our series. And today we're going to continue with talking about impacts and exposures by talking about wildfire and drought. And wildfire is always a big concern for us here in Southern California. And in fact, over the weekend, we locally had about 5 different little fires break out. Fortunately, the largest one was contained at about 50 acres. But this is something that is obviously very high on our radar all the time. And same thing with drought, always worried about the access to water and the availability of water. So we are hoping that today some of you are going to be willing to share some of your experiences in your areas with wildfire and drought. So just keep your ears open and wait for those moments where one of us says, who wants to share? You can raise your hand and we can unmute you, or you can type something into the question box. And we're going to stick with the question box. It looks like the chat box has some issues. So let's just stick with the question box, whether it's a question or a comment that you want to make. Or like I said, if we want people to participate with a story, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. So Angie, take it away.
All right, hi everybody. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're sticking with us. I see more and more people rolling in, and a lot of people have been watching the videos afterwards, so we're glad to have those archived and available for you. You've been now with us on a few webinars already. We've gone through and have a pretty good understanding of how climate change works, how it affects tribes, tribal health, and now just last session we started diving deeper. Last session, we reviewed temperature extremes as an exposure and all the effects of that. This time, we're going to dive into 2 more exposures, so wildfire and drought. And so some of the content is going to start to seem familiar. The format is going to start to seem familiar, and I think all that's a really good thing because it's going to build better learning capacity. And as always, our goal here is to help you feel more prepared with knowledge and tools and resources to conduct the climate adaptation work that you're probably working on in your community to build resilience. And yes, so today will be interactive. I've got polls, we've got group discussions, and then like Shasta said, if anybody wants to volunteer their stories, there'll be opportunities for that. And it's Shasta's birthday, so if you want to send her a note, you can do that too in the question box.
Yeah,
Happy birthday, Shasta.
Whoever gets closest to my age wins a prize.
I should have polled, but maybe not.
Yes, I'm 18.
All right, so like always, we start our conversations every couple of weeks with talking about our last suggested reading. And this past one, we suggested you read a really hot off the press document. It's called Mapping Resilience, a Blueprint for Thriving in the Face of Climate Disasters, released by APIN. And I found it super relevant to the work that we're doing here with the Tribal Climate Health Project, and I thought you might find it interesting too, especially if you're kind of interested in vulnerable populations and data, which is what this report's really about. I'm hoping that folks, as we're talking through the reading a little bit, can be chatting or using the discussion or question box to tell us what you read that surprised you, any particular thoughts you might like to share with the rest of the group that can be helpful. I really found this to be a unique report, and I just wanted to present it so it's available to you. It is California specific, but I think it could be relevant for everybody. It really is talking about how climate change has unequal effects on frontline populations, and that those populations are already facing challenges of their own, from health to other areas, and that includes, of course, Native American communities. So this report does a good job of outlining populations vulnerable to certain climate exposures, and it also reviews tools that measure and display many of these interacting factors that influence climate vulnerability in different communities, which is a really complex issue. If you started diving into the work of vulnerability assessments, which we will do in 2 more webinars, you will know that it takes a lot of work to find information from different places, and this is sort of doing an assessment of how available comprehensive decision-making tools and data are. So it gives some folks some places to go for data, but one thing that it points out is that the field really lacks a common centralized indicator set or assessment framework, and that'll make more sense as we get into vulnerability assessments. But that's one of the things Tribal Climate Health Project is doing. Paula, who just was awarded some new funds to help try to tackle some data gaps and some indicator sets. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over now to you guys. If anybody had any comments about this report, if you got a chance to read it.
And feel free to raise your hand if you have any remarks you want to make, and up to and including maybe some of your frustrations with not having time to read all of the stuff that's available out there. I don't know about you guys, but I'm seeing all sorts of stuff, and it's hard to do it all. Oh, and Angie, it looks like we might be in presenter mode. Can you switch to slide mode?
I'm not sure what that means. It's not looking normal?
Yeah, if anybody can, in the question box, let us know what you're seeing. Are you seeing the slides or are you seeing the notes?
Oh. Okay, hang on.
Oh, now you just see our big faces.
Let me just go ahead and make sure I'm showing you the right screen.
Okay, yeah, it looks like everybody's seeing the split screen with the notes as well as our.
Well, that's embarrassing. Hang on just a second, everybody. All right. This should
There we go.
work. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody.
But hey, at least everybody got to see the happy birthday Shasta part. That's the most important part, right?
Totally. All right. Anybody have any comments on the readings? I'm going to keep talking for just a second. This chart up here is actually one of the data sets they point to. It's a social vulnerability index, and that's just one of many, many types of information that's important for tribes and other communities as they're looking at their vulnerability, something that's available nationwide. So you can look at your region right now and just see, am I high, medium, or low in terms of social vulnerability?
And we do have a comment here from Peary White saying, shocked that farm workers didn't work with personal protective equipment after falling ash. And we need to be more aware of the health effects of fires. And that's a great point.
Yes. Thank you. And a good segue into talking about our topics for today. But before we do, I do have a poll for us. And so let me go ahead and select the poll. So we were talking a little bit about data. All right. And so that popped up for you, right, Shasta?
Yep.
Okay, so the question is, how prepared do you feel to find climate vulnerability information and data sets relevant to your community? And your options are not prepared at all. I'm aware of a few relevant indicators and data sources. I know what information to look for and where to find it, or I feel very prepared to identify and analyze data. So just tell us where you're at in terms of finding relevant information that you can use in your vulnerability assessments.
Now, I love watching as people fill in their answers and seeing the percentages and how many of you have voted. And we're at 89%. So we still have a few holdouts thinking hard about their answer. Or perhaps thinking hard about their next move in Pokemon Go. 93%, all right.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna go ahead and close and share. Let's see what people had to say. All right, so that's good. Not very many of you feel not prepared at all. So it looks like the majority feel, 60% feel that they have a few relevant indicators and data sources they can be aware of. 20% know where to go for information, and then 12 are ahead of the curve and feel very prepared to identify and analyze data. Okay, that's helpful. We are totally going to talk more about data once we dive into vulnerability assessments, but it's relevant throughout here because every time we talk about an exposure, we're talking about something that might be measurable that you're going to want to understand how it's impacting your community. And the way to do that is to look for an appropriate indicator and some information that can help you measure how severe or likely that's happening to your community. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that. So now we're back on the screen. Okay, let's move into the topic of the day. So like we said, this is the framework we've been using to design this entire training. And so today's topics are wildfire and drought. So that will tick off another 2 of the top of the main 5 primary exposures. And then the next round we'll be doing the last 2, storms and flooding and melting ice and sea level rise. And so as we did last time, we'll be talking through secondary exposures, impacts, sample strategies, and tribal case studies, hopefully including your own if you have some experience to share. All right, wildfire. We're going to start from the top, just like we did last time. And so some of the information we get at a national level comes from the Climate Science Special Report, which we said came out last year from the U.S. Global Change Research Project. And it says that the incidence of large forest fires, particularly in the western U.S. and Alaska, have increased since the early 1980s. You can see on the right, that's a chart that came from the EPA, and it's showing a pretty obvious trend increase in area burned, meaning millions of acres burned in the entire United States over time. You can see an increase. The projections, which is another diagram right below, are basically further increases in both frequency and intensity in those regions as climate warms and dries, and with profound changes to certain ecosystems. So that means as ecosystems change due to, in some cases, the heat and the drying, we're going to see more fuels, which will lend themselves be conducive to wildfire conditions. And so we also see longer burn season. Sometimes in California, we say the whole year is a burn season. The traditional burn seasons are is not applicable in the new normal that we talk about. The regions that are most affected by wildfire are Alaska, the Northwest, and the Southwest, and so generally western parts of the United States. However, if you look at those projections on the right, you can see spots of projected increases in very large fires by mid-century all over the place. So for folks on the phone, you can pretty much come from any region, and it may be an issue for you unless you're sort of on the top there of New England. All right. So I'm wondering if you could add something to the question box. What health impacts might you anticipate from these exposures? And they might be fairly obvious, and that's okay. And Shasta, if you see anything pop up, go ahead and read it out.
I will jump in with answers. And we already got one response earlier about the personal protective equipment for workers who are near ashfall from wildfire. So Aaron Jones, he mentions lung illnesses, respiratory symptoms, mental stress and fatigue, and then this is a good one, PTSD, for sure, post-traumatic stress.
Totally, thank you for raising that.
Yeah, and Puri White mentions food insecurity. Yeah, that's a big one too.
You guys are getting good at this. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in.
Homelessness. Actually, we got a few more coming in. Now everybody's excited. So homelessness. And Noah Saperstein mentions most of the Great Lakes Basin isn't expected to see a rise in fire risk. Why does the northwestern corner of the basin seek such a high increased risk of fire? So that's according to the map.
Yeah, according to the map. That's coming from the climate and health assessment. So why don't we can look at that for you, and why don't we see if there's an answer there for the Great Lakes area. I was surprised by it too.
Well, and I think what a lot of this is also a little bit on the relative side, because if you look down in the very lower southwest corner in San Diego, where I am, the increase in weeks with very large fires is actually in the 0 to 5 or the 5 to 10% range. Or I'm sorry, those are hundreds, but we already have so many fires that adding weeks to that is, from a percentage perspective. Hello, somebody's trying to call me right in the middle of the webinar. That increased percentage is based on, we already have 50 weeks a year of high risk of fire. So you add 2 more weeks to that, it's not that much. In the upper Midwest and in the Great Lakes region, the risk is already very low. So even if you're going from 2 weeks of high fire risk to 4 weeks of high fire risk or 10 weeks of high fire risk, that's like a 500% increase.
That's right. Yes, good point.
Yeah, and a lot of other, I'll just briefly, some of these other responses, stress of displacement from fires, an increased vulnerability to landslides in Southern California. It comes from Levi Anderson, who's here in SoCal with me. Lung diseases, asthma, homelessness, increased stress, etc., from Eileen Nunez. So thank you all for those responses, and you're all right. There's a lot of disparate and diverse impacts from wildfire.
Yeah, you guys did a great job. We got a really good head start here. So those are the primary exposures. Let's talk about primary impacts before we get into the secondary exposures. So obviously, wildfire can sometimes come with wildfire-related injury and death. And I think in recent years, maybe we're learning that this is a pretty big possibility, that we can actually see some pretty sizable scale fatalities. For example, big news was last year, the deadliest fire in California was the Camp Fire in Paradise, California, wiped out thousands of structures, but also killed over 80 people. On the right, these are just some indicators. So I'm sort of trying to help you see both the national impacts, but also start bringing up the conversation of indicators so that we start thinking in terms of how do we measure this? How do we know if this is coming to us and how severely? And so wildfire hazard potential, that's one important indicator. This is a map of the entire United States. So you can see in the West quite a bit of areas that are considered high or very high wildfire hazard potential. That's a marker of where if there are people that are living there, then they might be at risk of injury and death and other impacts that we'll talk about. Another way to look at it is the percentage of people, percent of population living in a very high wildfire risk area. So what you're looking at on the bottom right is San Diego County, and some areas that are purple are the highest, meaning higher than other census tracts in California, where people are at risk of very high wildfire risk areas. And so these kinds of data sources, data sets, visualization tools are available all over the country, and we're going to talk more about that as we go through this training. Somebody mentioned PTSD. Mental health impacts, including post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, and grief, are all very important impacts of wildfire. A recent RAND study found that 1/3 of the adult survivors of California wildfires in 2003 suffered depression, and 1/4 suffered PTSD. And there's all sorts of studies and interesting information on this. One of our advisors had told us that 80% of people after a disaster, natural disaster like a wildfire, will cope well in the aftermath, and 20% might find themselves in need of some sort of treatment. So just some information for you that comes out of more of the psychology industry. And so this on the right is, I found interesting. So what happens when people experience a disaster or traumatic event? And this is coming out of the American Psychological Association. And so it's talking about feelings become intense and sometimes unpredictable, thoughts and behavior patterns are affected, recurring emotional reactions are common, interpersonal relationships can become strained, particularly if you're living in temporary housing. Physical symptoms may accompany the stress, right? So physiological changes as a result of psychological changes. So we also know that wildfires can certainly limit access to health services or emergency services because they may damage infrastructure, critical infrastructure. So we are very familiar with this in California. Power outages are pretty common as a result of wildfire. And because we're afraid now of wildfire, because wildfires are such a big threat, we now see something called de-energization, which is when the utility companies have the authority to actually preemptively shut off power in California communities because they're worried that there might be high winds or wildfire risk. And so communities now are just vulnerable to power outages just because of the risk of wildfire. Road closures, we've seen this happen in communities time and time again. Very important for tribal communities who may have limited arteries, meaning like access points. They may only have one way to come in and out of their reservation. If one goes down, that could be extremely scary. The tribes I work with talk a lot about being worried about folks being trapped in the case of a road closure or of a wildfire, sort of inundating into key transportation road access points. Damaged health and emergency facilities, so say your key clinic or emergency center or hospital is damaged. Those facilities can also become overwhelmed in the case of a large emergency, probably in Paradise. I'm imagining those hospitals were very overwhelmed. 911, paramedics, those type of services, at least in the short run, can become overwhelmed. There are actually adaptation plans that sometimes hospitals will implement for themselves, where they're trying to change their predictions for the demand of their services in large-scale events. So if you are a community that works closely with local health providers, that might be a conversation to have. And it can also lead to school and business closures, as well as economic damages, and we're going to talk more about that. So secondary exposures. So somebody had mentioned that, yes, wildfires have a relationship to oops, excuse me, I lost an image. They have a relationship to landslides, mudslides, erosion. That's totally true. And so it can interact with storms and flooding, which is a topic we're going to talk about in 2 more weeks. And it also can trigger the following secondary exposures. So air quality concerns would be increased smoke or particulate matter in the air. Vector-borne disease, there's actually a relationship with that, meaning ticks, West Nile virus, and forest pests all have relationships to wildfire. Water insecurity and food insecurity. Wildfires can both lead to water contamination as well as supply disruption, and food contamination and supply disruption. So really, we'd be talking about instances where runoff debris from a fire may be somewhat toxic and runs off into a water supply later on after some rain. That could be leading to contamination. Or if you are in a situation where folks are evacuated or trapped for a long period of time, you may not be able to get food or water in for folks. Does anybody want to try to anticipate the health impacts of some of these secondary exposures?
Remember, this is your opportunity again to not only talk about what you might be concerned about, but also have some things exposed or revealed to you that you might not have considered as being related to wildfire.
Well, we are going to go in and talk about it. And somehow I lost my fun diagram, which is talking about something called smoke waves, which is just a term to know about when we talk about particulate matter, which is actually a little bit more about my next slide. Particulate matter is a component of air pollution that is is somewhat common, especially in more urbanized areas. It's part of fuel combustion, and it's small particulates in the air that can irritate the respiratory system. But it can also come from wildfire. So smoke can create additional particulate matter. It makes a lot of sense. You've got a lot of things burning and creating fine particles in the air. Smoke waves are a way to talk about the incident of a wildfire creating a temporary, severe increase in particulate matter directly related to a wildfire, rather than looking at what's usually available, which might be a more annual or monthly particulate matter piece of data, which isn't as meaningful if you're really looking at wildfire. Okay, so let's talk about the respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses. So we know that exposure to smoke-related air pollutants, including particulate matter from wildfire, has been associated with a wide range of health effects. Those could include cardiovascular consequences, early delivery for a baby, birth weight changes, and the strongest evidence is for respiratory illness. And so on the right here, you see emergency department visits for asthma. You see a lot of asthma incidents during and after, even for weeks, a wildfire. And so that's one piece of data that you could look for. And on the bottom here, this is an interesting one. It comes out of CDC's National Environmental Public Health Tracking System again. It's areas and population vulnerable to predicted surface smoke from wildfires. So this is a baseline number, meaning at any point in time, you can actually go on here and find out if the fires that are occurring right now are creating any vulnerabilities for your populations in your area. Pretty cool. To see it on a map is pretty cool. According to the EPA, almost 20% of Californians are exposed to unhealthy air. And so there's some evidence around recent fires. One of them was the Camp Fire in 2018. And so they were able to document widespread pollution across Northern California. And they were experiencing some of the dirtiest air in the world at the time. And in the Bay Area, where some of the air had traveled over, the air qualities were ranked among the region's worst air quality on record. And so as a result, there were health advisories and widespread school closures and warnings to stay indoors. Also, valley fever is something else that comes up. Valley fever is a fungal infection that happens mainly on the West Coast as well. We're going to talk about it more in terms of drought, but valley fever can be released. It's a fungus that can be released into the air and can be breathed in because due to wildfire. So let's hold the conversation on valley fever until drought.
And I do want to interject here a little bit about the smoke impacts. And it's true, California was having those severe smoke impacts from the Camp Fire, the Paradise Fire. But we also hear from tribal folks in places like, Idaho and Montana, from the wildfires taking place in Washington state. It was affecting their air quality that far away. And so that's a big issue to be concerned about. Even if the fire is 1,000 miles from you, you can still have those impacts from smoke over your region. And we do have a couple of comments real quickly. One was a question from Iris asking about fire culling the tick population. She thought that fire would cull that population. And the response to that is yes, initially, but as areas start to recover and they get brushy, they get grassy, it provides good habitat for ticks to recover and become more of a risk. And then a question about valley fever. Pets can also get valley fever, or can pets also get valley fever is the question. I actually don't know the answer to that. Angie, do you know?
I don't know the answer to that either. The conversations I've had have been all human related, but we can look into that.
Oh, I'll find out. My sister is a veterinary technician. I will ask her and she can ask her doctor, and I will let you guys know. Okay.
Well, yes, so we talked about Lyme last time when we talked about temperature extremes. So, just to reiterate, yes, what Shasta said is true. There's a relationship between wildfire and the ecosystem changes that promote conditions for ticks, which may carry Lyme. And and Lyme disease is spreading as a result of a variety of climate changes, not just wildfire, but you're seeing it spread over a larger area of the United States over time. So water insecurity and food insecurity, health impacts. So we talked about infections and illness from water. That's in the case where there's runoff from wildfire debris that may be contaminated and get into your waterways. Obviously, drinking water supply interruption is a big concern here. And the tribes that I work with, they get really concerned because they are responsible in many cases for their own firefighting, or they might do so as a region, but they may deplete their limited water supplies as a result of trying to fight the fire. And so the communities I work with don't have really good projections for how big of a fire, how big of a response they can manage and still be able to provide drinking water to their population. So it further stresses already limited groundwater supplies. And then, like we said, we might not be able to, if there's a big emergency, there's limitations on the transport of water supplies as well, and the same for food supplies. And so we talk about lack of nutritional and medicinal abundance. Also true if you are a tribe that's reliant on your own agriculture, or if you have medicinal crops that you might grow, and those are damaged or destroyed as a result of a wildfire. So we talk about vulnerable populations every time we go through an exposure. And so there are certain populations that are more vulnerable to the health impacts we just spoke about. Children and elders, transit dependent populations, meaning folks that rely on maybe public transit, don't have other means, and maybe living in far distances from urban centers. Neighborhoods in a fire severity zone or wildland urban interface. And so those are two terms, and there are usually maps available to find out if you are in one. Households lacking defensible space. Defensible space usually means a certain boundary, a certain yardage of boundary around a home or a building that is created to clear out brush so that you're at less risk of having your home burned down. People susceptible to health impacts from poor air quality are at risk. People with pre-existing mental, behavioral, or cognitive disorders. Folks dependent on electricity. We talked about that a little bit last time. Some people are considered electricity dependent because their medical equipment might rely on electricity, so power outages are a problem. And outdoor workers. Some of these population sensitivity and adaptive capacity factors. So from last time we talked about this a little bit. This really is what community characteristics make you more or less susceptible to the impacts that we are talking about. One is population in a high-risk wildfire area. Another one is percent of land covered by forests. So these are data points or indicators. So this will tell you if you're more or less vulnerable. Hospitals, are there enough hospitals around? economic hardship or social vulnerability index. We showed that map earlier. And the size of your water supply, and that would include water storage as well. Communities that I work with that are worried about wildfire, we talk a lot about water storage, and they typically are finding that that's usually a priority, is to find ways to store more water. Okay, so along with human health impacts, we also have impacts to social, economic, and cultural health. So some people talk to us about homelessness and displacement. Totally true. The communities I work with are very concerned about this. Oftentimes, communities in California have experienced some kind of a widespread evacuation, or folks on the West Coast. So it could be displacement of an entire community, of certain households for 1 day, 3 weeks. It could be permanent. I just did a work visit with a community in Southern California, and they feel like if a big wildfire really swept through, they may not be able to come back from that, at least for a very long time. So also, you'd be concerned about destruction of historical or cultural assets or sites. And so you may have an inventory of cultural assets in your community, and you would want to look at whether or not those are in a high-risk fire area, or even consider relocating some of those to less fire risk areas, or consider things like a defensible space around those areas. We also see disruptions to culturally important activities and species. Maybe an outdoor traditional event can't occur because a wildfire has occurred, or maybe the air quality is so bad. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the species that can be damaged as a result, including tree loss. So like oaks, which can be culturally important for a lot of tribes.
And that
you also see. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. So that's a good segue to a question from the ITEP Tribal Climate Change Program, whose actual name is Nikki, asking how can or where do vulnerable wildlife species fit into the sensitivity matrix? And definitely the consideration of wildlife species, whether they are culturally relevant species or just their relevance to the overall ecosystem, that is a part of our vulnerability assessment, is how they're going to be affected. And while we were talking, I texted my vet friend, and she says, yes, your animals can get valley fever, and that we see it in San Diego. She sees it semi-frequently, and that it's common in the Southwest. So that is a risk to your pets as well as to people.
That's a real-time answer. Thanks, Shasta.
Yep, sure.
What service? Okay, so also, it's pretty obvious that wildfires can also create closures of schools and businesses, so that has the potential for economic damage as well. So not only because wildfires can be very expensive to respond to and to recover from, but if a community is reliant upon maybe a critical economic driver is timber, you can see significant losses there. And also insurance premiums overall are expected to rise. And actually the California Fourth Climate Change Assessment expects that insurance premiums for fire are going to increase by 18% by 2055 in high-risk areas. So that affects all of us. All right, are there other thoughts on how cultural well-being and traditional ways of life may be disrupted by wildfire? You can use the question box, or you can raise a hand.
From Aaron Jones, he says exposure to smoke reduces the chances or amount of time elders are in the mountains gathering berries with the youth. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So traditional practices, just generally outdoors, probably be affected, at least for perhaps weeks after a wildfire.
And of course, wildfire can physically destroy cultural sites. I have a friend and colleague who her community experienced a wildfire in New Mexico, where a lot of ancient pueblos were damaged or destroyed by the severity of that wildfire, and it was extremely devastating to that community. So that's an enormous potential loss. And then we have another comment. Tribal members will be competing with wildlife for medicinal and food plants because they go into the same areas. Yeah, that's a great point from ITEP again, from Nikki.
And so on to that point of species, we're actually going to talk too on this slide about natural environment impacts. And so the way that the Tribal Climate Health Project approaches ecological changes is really in two ways, because we know that for tribes, their cultural health often depends upon certain culturally important species. So we look at culturally important species under cultural health or as a health metric, and we also look at it under the natural environment. And so, like we said, this training doesn't dive really deeply into the natural environment impacts, although they're plentiful, but just a little hint here at what some of those might be. You know, the natural environment impacts aren't always bad. Wildfire is a natural phenomenon, and is an important part of a natural ecosystem's healthy cycle. But where there are an increased severity, intensity, or frequency of these wildfires, we see disruptions, declines, and stresses to habitats, waterways, and important or sensitive plant and wildlife species. Things like invasive forest pests tend to proliferate in post-wildfire conditions. We see conversion to flammable grasses occurring. So this chart on the right, I think, is really interesting. It's again in San Diego, because a lot of the work that we've done with Paula and other places has been there, but this is available for other places. It's called a fire return interval departure. What that means is, like, is fire coming more often? How often is it coming? And is it coming more often than it normally would? And so you're starting to see less time in between fires, which means that there's less time for a normal ecosystem to regenerate itself in a healthy way. And so instead of having coastal, shrubs, you might work with woodlands, you might start converting to flammable gases, and that could be a permanent change. And then there's a vicious cycle, right? Because more flammable gases lead to more frequent wildfires again. And then you see wildlife migration. So as habitats are destroyed, wildlife will obviously change. Wildlife migration.
And we have
environment impacts.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Just another comment from Eileen Nunez. She says that wildfire for the Redwood Valley Rancheria, the 2017 Mendocino Complex fire, destroyed the tribe's native garden that they were using for basketry materials, and they are still working to recover that garden. So species that are occurring wild and also species that you're cultivating explicitly for cultural purposes can be badly impacted. And good luck, Eileen, with recovering your garden.
Yes, thank you. These examples are really great. Keep them coming. The built environment, I think this one might be fairly obvious. There are ways to look for critical structures that might be in a fire severity zone. And so we can talk more about that at another point. But homes, businesses, critical facilities, those are all public services and infrastructure. You want to know where these are, and are they in a fire severity zone. And then we talked about stress on water supplies, but I put it under built environment because we can obviously, there are areas of our built environment that can help us here in terms of our water supply systems, our distribution systems, our storage systems. Okay, I'm gonna move us along into the conversation about strategies. And so you can ignore that group discussion question, but what I prefer for you to do is actually in the question box as we go along, if you can think of another strategy that has helped your community adapt to wildfire, please throw it in there. Here's a few examples, and this is not an exhaustive list, there's a lot. You can develop an emergency or health management plan to anticipate and prepare public services and evacuation plans for wildfire risks. You can update air quality improvement plans to include exposure to wildfire. You can conduct outreach to encourage residents to sign up for emergency communication resources, because clear and reliable information can really help people move and evacuate in time, or stay indoors in the case of bad air quality. Conduct wildlife management strategies in adjacent forests, wildfire management strategies in adjacent forest lands, which many tribes do, such as prescribe burns and thinning to reduce fire risk. And then a lot of tribes are already doing this. They're working collaboratively with each other and perhaps county or other regional state agencies on emergency response team efforts, so coordination with other agencies. This here on the right is an example out of Sonoma. They experienced a giant wildfire, and this is what one of their foundations put together. It's a program, the Wildfire Mental Health Collaborative, and they do all sorts of programming around helping people who are struggling with their mental health in the aftermath of that big wildfire and all the losses that were experienced. Okay, anybody chat?
Yeah, Iris says fire safe councils. Residents are trained in fire emergency and proper defensible space, and they teach their neighbors. And Iris, I believe, is in Los Angeles, so that's obviously a really important thing for that region. And that's also along the lines of the emergency response teams or the CERT teams, certified emergency response teams, that some neighborhoods develop so that people are able to have some training to help their neighbors in disasters, and that includes wildfires.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move into this one. Is there any brave person who actually wants to speak up and tell us the story of how wildfire has affected their community? You can raise a hand.
I'm looking for hands. If you want to raise your hand, and I can actually unmute you if you want to share your story. We can hear a voice besides Angie and me.
In case we don't have anybody, I'm going to do a poll because that'll be nice and fast and everybody can just let us know quickly. Okay, so this poll says, it's sort of a true or false, my community has had an alarming experience with wildfire in recent history. And so it's either yes, no, or don't know.
And of course, the definition of alarming might change from person to person. To me, it would be alarming if there was a half-acre fire that was right next to my house,
right?
Which might not be so alarming to somebody else. But yeah, if it's something that you felt like you might need to evacuate from, or that the smoke was affecting you and your loved ones, your community, that's alarming. Or even the fact that fires are happening maybe closer to your community, they're larger, they're harder to control. Those are all ways to define alarming.
All right, so I'm going to close the poll. Got a good response there, and I'll share it. It's a lot. 71% of you said yes, you've had an alarming experience with wildfire in recent history. That's a whole lot. Only 19 said no. Okay, well, thank you for that. We need to move into drought and move a little more quickly. So same kind of structure here. We're going to go from the top, and we're going to talk about the key climate exposure facts at a national level. So we know that recent drought or water deficits have reached record intensity in parts of the country, and the main regions that are typically affected are the Southwest and Great Plains, although drought can affect other parts of the country as well. On the right, you see a map that was actually from earlier this year. It's more of a snapshot and a look ahead. So they do, the U.S. Drought Portal will do a outlook of a few months ahead to see if drought is expected. And so we had a fairly good year this year. This is not an indication of a long-term projection for drought, but I just wanted to make you aware that you can actually go on that site and get a short-term projection for drought in your community. There is strong evidence that climate change increases evapotranspiration and soil moisture deficits. That's come out of the Climate Science Special Report. And drought is really one of the most pervasive climate-induced weather exposures for tribes, in particular because there's a lot of reliance on groundwater sources that may be limited. And drought's interesting because there's a relationship here with storms and flooding. While it is true that we are going to see generally more drying in the community, it doesn't mean precipitation goes away completely. In fact, there is this relationship where precipitation actually becomes more intense. So there might be shorter, more intense periods of precipitation. They just happen potentially less frequently. And overall, you see a depletion of aquifer storage levels and things like that. And so that's kind of what you're seeing on the bottom right here is just changes in, this is in Southern California area, in precipitation. And so that's on the left is just, you can see a sort of a trend downward in precipitation. Not super extreme because like I said, you're getting these more torrential downpours in some areas. If you're in New Mexico, which I was earlier this year, you're talking about things like a haboob or some kind of major storm, monsoon might be coming through, but maybe less frequently. You get less frequent regular rain. And then you start seeing things like drier day or more frequent dry days. So that's another good metric or indicator we use for climate vulnerability. How many dry days will there be? And you can see a little bit of an increase happening in San Diego County, which is already dry. So what health impacts might you anticipate? And I'm going to go ahead and continue along, but I shout them out as you read them, Shasta.
Yeah, this is a cue to you guys to go ahead and add those things to the question box. Health impacts from drought.
This one's kind of a tricky one, I think. It's not like a wildfire where there's an emergency, right? This is a more gradual health impact, and so there won't be this major event necessarily. You can kind of see it coming in some cases.
And Aaron brings one up. Aaron brings up something it's actually kind of counterintuitive when you're talking about drought. But he says for the Northwest, we will see stagnant water pools leading to vector-borne exposures. Absolutely. You get those stagnant pools, you get those mosquitoes in there, and it definitely increases the risk of mosquito-borne disease.
That's totally right. Thank you. We're gonna talk about that.
Yeah. And then Caroline brings up worse water quality in general.
Yep. Okay, good. Let's talk for a second about mental health. There's a mental health component here. There's been some research on the relationship between mental health and drought. And we see that communities experiencing drought can have anxiety, grief, and helplessness. And sometimes that comes as a result of displacement because folks may need to leave, or they might feel like leaving is becoming more and more imminent. Economic change or insecurity, meaning livelihoods that depend on water-dependent industries might be at risk, so things like agriculture. And then damage to the environment causes stress for folks if people feel a loss as a result of the changes happening to their environment. There are secondary exposures for drought, and so somebody had mentioned a couple of them. There are some air quality changes that occur as a result of drought. As the soils and land dry up, you see more getting kicked up, sometimes in the form of dust, in the form of allergens, and also a relationship with ozone. There's also water supply disruption. Obviously, this is the big one. Lower agricultural yields, so that would be a food insecurity issue. There's West Nile virus. There's a relationship there with West Nile. Hantavirus, that's a virus carried by rodents that has a relationship here to drought as well. A lot of times when we talk about these vector-borne diseases and drought, we're talking about the water sources depleting, meaning that we're bringing creatures in closer proximity to each other to interact and potentially share disease. And then forest infestation and disease too. So as water stress weakens vegetation and forests, it introduces vulnerability to forest pests. Okay, so we'll dive into respiratory and cardiovascular illness. So I think the conversation around valley fever is important and interesting. This is a map of areas endemic for the fungus that leads to valley fever, which is the disease. And so you can see a lot of it happening in the West. Drought conditions will, they reduce, so the fungus appears to grow best in soil after a heavy rainfall, actually, and becomes airborne most effectively during hot, dry conditions. And so there's cases of valley fever in the areas we're looking at, and they've increased over time, about 15%. Each year from 1998 from 2011. And actually, I've talked to people who've known people who have gotten it, so it's not such a remote possibility. Vector-borne disease, we talked about West Nile and hantavirus. This is a map of the incidence of West Nile virus and neuroinvasive disease in the United States. So you just see it growing. This is just a span of a few years. I'm sure there's a more recent version. And so the relationship, like I said, it's higher prevalence of the virus in mosquito and bird populations, and that has a lot to do with being in closer contact with each other as they congregate around remaining water sources. And so a lot of that happens in the Southwest. Drinking water, supply interruption. I mean, this one's fairly obvious, especially for communities that are reliant upon their groundwater. And as soil moisture lessens, we just see aquifer depletion as well, and storage is going down. And so you may be able to measure this for yourself, well levels, groundwater levels. And when we reduce the quantity, we also sometimes see a reduction in water quality because of low flow and stagnant conditions that can increase the concentration of pollutants and contaminants. Pathogens as well. Okay, so vulnerable, so fewer impacts maybe to talk about with drought, but very significant. Like I said, potentially this is maybe the biggest impact that many tribes will face. And so there are vulnerable populations, so children and elders probably are more susceptible for some of the air quality concerns, as well as just lack of like a water shortage. Communities that are relying on groundwater for drinking water would be particularly vulnerable. Agricultural workers that depend on a healthy, thriving agricultural industry. People susceptible to health impacts from poor air quality are vulnerable. Folks with mental, behavioral, and cognitive disorders, and again, electricity dependent populations. The factors that make you more or less sensitive might include the population size of vulnerable individuals, your food environment. There's something called a food environment index that you can actually look up for yourself. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has something called county rankings, and you can look up your food environment index to see basically how many people are food insecure in your community and how in close proximity you are to decent food sources. Proximity to transit and size of your water system, including storage. So some of the impacts to social, economic, and cultural health, displacement. In this way, I want to mention relocation and from the perspective of domestic migration. This is a EPA projection about where people are going to move by the end of the century. And so you can see, folks, the blue is people entering, migrating to a community. The red is people leaving. And so you generally see in the middle and south, people leaving and generally going up to the upper northeast and northwest. Partially and not fully as a result of drought, but also other climate conditions. So disruptions to culturally important activities and species, definitely in Washington and northwestern California, we've seen that drought has decimated certain fishing populations, which can be an important food and an important economic driver, as well as a cultural, a cultural tradition, a cultural resource. And so, for example, the Yurakupa and Kuruk tribes on the Klamath and Trinity rivers have seen some impacts to their traditional fishing practices. The California Climate Assessment mentions that water shortages are expected in the future to cost up to $1 billion a year. And that partially could be in agricultural losses and the need to remediate water shortages.
So I'm noticing, since we're just a few minutes from 10 o'clock, that some people are jumping off, but of course we're recording. So if you need to come back and watch the end of the recording, if you have a 10 o'clock meeting, we will have this up on the webinar portal on our website in probably by the end of today.
All right, thanks. Yeah, we might just go a couple over, but I'm going to just quickly go through Major natural environment impacts when it comes to drought, we're not going to focus too much on it, but things like tree mortality, which is the diagram on the bottom right, happen as water stress might weaken trees, forests, as well as pest infestation, decline in wetlands, riparian tree diebacks, loss of wildlife and aquatic species. There are several strategies that can address impacts, and so lots of communities have things like drought contingency plans. They might restrict development in high-risk areas to reduce the water burden. They might develop water conservation efforts within their communities for households and businesses and agricultural operations. They can build infrastructure needed for aquifer storage and recovery. They may diversify their options for water supply and expand current sources. Some tribes even consider renegotiating water treaties, which I know is a controversial issue. And some decide they want to increase, maybe more water storage tanks on the reservation. There are a lot more examples of tribes that have gone through this, as well as adaptation strategies that would be applicable for communities like yours. There are links embedded throughout these slides. So as we send this out, feel free to go back and click on any of the images are usually linked. And so you can go look at a website. That video I just passed by, that's a good one. It's a Navajo video, and it talks specifically about their experience with drought, which is pretty significant. So that's today. I want to really thank everybody for again joining us and being part of our training community. Next time we're going to talk about storms and flooding, melting ice, and sea level rise, and that's going to wrap up our exposures. In advance of that, it might be helpful for you to take a look at a reading from the National Wildlife Federation called Facing the Storm, Indian Tribes, Climate-Induced Weather Extremes, and the Future for Indian Country. It's a little older of a document, but I think it's good and would feel relevant for some of you. Are there any final questions for today?
I just want to add that this was a lot of information to absorb today. So we do have that Google group, which so far we're getting just a little bit of engagement on that. But that's a place where we can talk more about some of these impacts. If you want to talk a little bit more about drought and wildfire, and if you have more questions, because we had some good questions today, and we can crowdsource those questions. Not everybody has a best friend who's a vet, so you can't just ask your Valley Fever question to your pals, but that's what we're here for, to learn from each other and to be able to post that information for us all to be able to learn. So thank you again for being here today, and I don't see any other questions coming up, so I think we're gonna wrap it up for today.
All right, just about on time. Thanks guys so much. See you next time.
Bye.